Hello and welcome back to OCD Coded. I am Erin Brown, a licensed marriage and family therapist and mental health counselor. I also have OCD myself, and I want to really help you to understand a little more about OCD and to help to translate it for yourself, and others, and to help to learn how to use it as a strength and not to see it as something that is wrong with you. So, today we're going to be talking about OCD perfectionism, which I did not know at first was that perfectionism was a type of OCD. And so that's another one of those that a lot of people will say, oh, I'm a perfectionist, but there is actually a type of OCD where again, the obsession is perfection. And and then, so the compulsion is trying to do perfect. And what's so hard about that, trying to do perfect, trying to be perfect. And what's so hard about that is there's more overlap there with ADD also, where becoming so overwhelmed when you get a whole list of things to do that you feel like you can't do it. And with perfectionism, there's kind of the idea of I can't do it perfectly, I don't want to do it at all, and just how much fear is involved in that. And it's a thing I talk a lot about in sessions with clients about how to try to see that perfectionism as it's been a coping skill, that the fear, it's been trying to help, thinking that if we're perfect, then we won't be abandoned. And how, as we've talked about in other videos, that like that fear of abandonment is really big for a social species like humans, and it can do a lot like with trauma, like we talking about last week, um, and that feeling powerless in a life or death situation. There's also the trauma research conference that is happening this week, hosted by the Trauma Research Foundation. I've been learning a ton and can't wait to talk all more about that also. But they brought up another definition of trauma that I thought was really powerful and got right to the point about it, which was that a trauma is any stimulus that is greater than the organism is designed to handle. And wow, let me say that again. Trauma is any stimulus that is greater than the organism is designed to handle. So whatever it is for that specific person, that this stimulus, whatever has happened, this change, this trauma, this whatever event happened was more impactful than we designed to handle. And so again, that whatever the person is doing is a normal response, is their best response essentially to is like its own overwhelmed kind of place. And so when an organism is overwhelmed, you just have to do your best. And like that it's the event is the stimulus is greater than the organism is designed to handle. And so, and that comes so much into this about it's been said like how to switch from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And I think so much of that is, and so much of what the trauma conference has been talking about is how loneliness is a big part of that. And that so much of loneliness is the feeling of being misunderstood, and how we can deal with people, like how when we feel misunderstood, all the different ways we go about trying to do that, and that pain and the chronic trauma of being misunderstood. And that goes along so much with trauma also that I've seen in my own practice and in my personal life about that, like the traumatic event itself, is impactful, obviously, but also the response of the other people around them, whether it's to deny or to blame or it less favorable, any non-favorable kind of responses can be a lot more devastating to the person. I don't want to say more devastating, but can leave another kind of lasting, it's another part of the trauma. It's not just the same or part of that first one. It's a whole other trauma on top of it, of feeling misunderstood or that their reaction to trauma was wrong or bad. And so now, that like now I've had this trauma happen to me, and now I feel like I'm being judged for my response to this trauma. And so how we can start to just really look at that differently. And the way that all plays into OCD with that too, and with OCD perfectionism, is that idea of if I'm not perfect, I'll be abandoned. And so that negative voice that we can hear in our head, like, oh, you didn't do this right, or whatever. And so that self-dialogue, maybe I should say, how it's really how we can all learn to look at all of that in a different way and try to just be curious about it. And with OCD, there tends to be a great sense of responsibility that is a large part of the struggles to overcome with it, or just this feeling of responsibility that I am responsible for other people's emotions, that I am responsible for not disappointing anyone, that I'm responsible for, and going back to thought action fusion, that if I think something, it's as bad as doing the thing, that I'm responsible extra morally in that way for every thought that I have, that like I have to be responsible and take responsibility for it. And it can lead to this really deep shame cycle that's happening where people are trying to take responsibility for things, but obsessing about that kind of responsibility. And then the ways that we compulsively try to reduce that distress of the unknown, which would be, about any of those, how to, either to soothe myself or try to be perfect or soothe myself that I'm not perfect or dissociate or escape in whatever kind of way, and how that's all related to fear. And it's reminding that they call OCD the doubting disease and a fear-based disease. And I think that that's really powerful to remember, that it's how those fears really manifest, and they can manifest in all different ways for people. But that perfectionism, when we see it, and how we can approach that differently, to know that, okay, if I can look at this as an OCD symptom, does that start to loosen the grip it has on me, that it feels so real? And a thing I like to say in session a lot is, it's like trying to tell a fish what water is. And that was how it was for me, trying to think of like, oh, I don't have to believe this, this feeling of I'm responsible for other people's emotions or for not disappointing anyone, that those are deep ones, that go back to, I heard first in the trauma research conference a few years ago, and Gabor Mate saying that the two things that really need to be like eradicated from every single human is that idea that I must not disappoint anyone, and the idea that I'm responsible for other people's emotions. And that really stuck with me for a really long time. And I'm always looking for that kind of simplified, like, what do we need to do to really, what can we hone in on, and not overcomplicate? And it's, simple, not easy, and those were two of them. And I think it goes right along with that perfectionism OCD, and that feeling of extra responsibility that OCD has, and how that all plays together with the idea of empathy and compassion. And that was another thing I had talked about in a previous video, but I feel is worth repeating, about that, empathy is more of, I see you and I feel your pain. And compassion is, I can care about you and see your pain, but I don't have to feel your pain. And that can be really hard to distinguish. But that empathy is supposed to be more of a short-term response, but that with empathy, there tends to be this uh, more heightened sense of responsibility, that if I see someone in pain and I feel their pain, then I now feel kind of responsible for their pain and responsible for fixing their pain, which can be something we see, well, and I see a lot in families, and, even in my own self, and have to be careful with being a counselor and all of that too, about, that what that feeling of responsibility for somebody's pain, and how that can lead to not great outcomes that we, in any kind of way, that like, but how I can walk with someone in that. And it's so hard to do, whether it's with my, personal relationships or professional relationships, but that, that's what that, so empathy is being able to, see their pain and feel their pain. But again, it cannot be a long-term response. And I just think it's interesting too, how much with processing disorders, empathy is talked about, and that it's not that people don't have empathy, it's differences in processing empathy, and how this feeling of empathy and over responsibility that OCD has, and how, it can be this over responsibility, but then it can, also kind of flip that other way of feeling not responsible for the things need to, and not necessarily with OCD, but just saying that, like how to look at all these symptoms in a different kind of way of, again, not what's wrong with somebody, but just we're all interacting to this pain of feeling of other people's pain, and then feeling responsible for their pain, and then feeling powerless to fix it. But that comes from a good place in us, that we know what it's like to be in pain, and we don't want other people to be in pain. But that the kind of moral, or in summary and kind of action point for all of this is, can we just try to be curious? Can we try to not judge ourselves or others, but to be curious about what is happening and to open a dialogue in that of, that I can't assume that everyone thinks sees the world the way I do. And, but how hard and difficult that is also, but then being able to really, remember that disappointing people is not our, that is about like those two take home messages of it's okay, like it has to be okay to disappoint, that we can't be responsible for that kind of thing, and how to deal with those responsibilities. And that when that feeling comes up, and especially how with OCD, it is really difficult, and but can be done. And that's the message of hope with all of this is it just feels like this loop that you can't get out of, but there are things that you can do, things that we've talked about today. And, if you want more information, please check out my website and any other things, or reach out to me directly, message me on the page or like post on the page, and let me know, in the ways that you feel like questions I could answer, or ways that I could help take this a little further, and explaining, how to really overcome these kind of really hard, but also, strength-based parts of us. So I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day. I hope you got something from that, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.